She never told him. 40 years of marriage, 2 children, a lifetime of shared meals, quiet evenings, and whispered goodnights. And she never told him. Emmett Hollister died in January 1986, believing he knew everything about his wife, Annalise. He knew she was German. He knew she had lost her family in the war. He knew she had crossed an ocean to be with, leaving behind everything she had ever known. But he did not know about Joachim. He did not know that his wife had given birth to a son in 1944, during the darkest days of the war. He did not know that she had hidden this child for 11 months, terrified that the Nazis would discover him and kill them both. He did not know that she had placed her baby in an orphanage and walked away, her heart shattering with every step. He did not know that for 14 years, Annalise had been writing letters to this son in secret, sending money, receiving photographs of grandchildren he would never meet. Emmett died without knowing any of this, but his children were about to find out. 3 weeks after Annalisa followed her husband to the grave, a letter arrived from Germany, and the secret she had protected for 4 decades finally came into the light. This is her story. A story of love that survived war. A story of sacrifice that spanned an ocean. A story of a mother who gave up everything to save a child no one could ever know existed. Please subscribe to this channel right now. Your support helps us tell more incredible stories like this one. Like this video, and share it with someone who loves history. And whatever you do, watch until the end, because what happened when Annalisa's 3 children finally met will stay with you forever. Emmett Hollister had turned 24 years old 3 weeks earlier in a foxhole outside Nuremberg. No cake, no candles, just a cigarette shared with Corporal Alvin Kowalczyk and the constant rumble of artillery in the distance. He was from Hollenbach, Pennsylvania, a coal town of 42,000 people tucked into the Appalachian foothills, where his father Virgil had worked the mines until black lung killed him. In 1938, Emmett had joined the army in 1942, 2 months after Pearl Harbor, because staying home meant the mines, and the mines meant dying slow like his father had. War, he figured, was at least dying fast. He had fought across France and into Germany. He had seen things that made sleep difficult and silence unbearable. He had learned that Germans bled the same red as Americans, that they screamed the same way when bullets tore through them. But he had also learned not to think about that. Thinking got you killed. Thinking made your hands shake when you needed them steady. Now the war was ended. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. And Emmett stood behind a wooden table at the gates of Stalag 7A, processing an endless river of prisoners who had nowhere left to go. The camp had been liberated on April 29th by the 14th Armored Division. Inside the wire, they had found more than 110,000 people crammed into a space designed for 10,000. German soldiers who had surrendered, foreign workers who had been forced into labor, civilians who had fled the Russian advance, women who had served in auxiliary roles, cooking and cleaning and sorting supplies for the Wehrmacht, all of them hungry, all of them exhausted, all of them waiting to learn what would happen next. Emmett's job was simple. He sat at the processing table, checked identification papers, assigned barracks numbers, and handed out ration cards. 1 person every 2 minutes. 30 people an hour. The line never seemed to get shorter. Most of the prisoners kept their eyes down when they approached the table. Some were defiant, their jaws set, refusing to show weakness even in defeat. Others were broken, their shoulders slumped, their faces empty. But one woman was different. She stood in line for nearly an hour, waiting her turn in the cold April drizzle. She did not push forward. She did not complain. She simply stood, her back straight, her hands folded in front of her. When she finally reached the table, Emmett looked up from his paperwork and felt something shift in his chest. She was thin, her cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin. She wore a faded gray Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, too large for her frame, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and collar. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a braid that had come loose in places. But it was her eyes that stopped him. They were pale blue, clear and direct, and they held a sadness so deep that Emmett felt like he was looking into a well with no bottom. "Name," he said in German. He had learned enough of the language over the past year to handle these interviews. "Annalise Kettner?" Her voice was quiet but steady. "Age?" 23. Occupation before the war. I was a student. University of Munich. Literature and languages. Emmett wrote the information down. His handwriting looked clumsy next to her careful German script on the identification papers she handed him. Where are you from? He asked. Regensburg, a city on the Danube River, north of Munich. Family? She hesitated for the first time. My parents. My younger brother. All gone. Gone where? Dead. And she said it without emotion, as if the word had been emptied of meaning through repetition. My father and brother were killed in the bombing of Regensburg in February 1945. My mother died 3 weeks later. Pneumonia. There were no medicines left. Emmett looked at her identification card again. The photograph showed the same face, but younger, fuller, smiling slightly at the camera. It had been taken in 1942, before the world had finished breaking. You speak English, he said, switching languages. Yes, I studied it at university. I wanted to be a translator. She paused. Before. There was that word again. Before. As if the world had split in two and everything good had stayed on the other side. Emmett stamped her papers and handed her a ration card. Barrack 17, Women's Section. Meals twice daily. Do not leave the camp without authorization. She took the card and met his eyes again. Thank you. She turned to leave, but Emmett heard himself speak before he could stop. What were you studying? At university? Annalisa looked back at him, surprised by the question. English and American literature. Hemingway? Steinbeck. F. Scott Fitzgerald. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. I read The Great Gatsby in English. It took me 3 months. Then she walked away, disappearing into the crowd of prisoners moving toward the barracks. Emmett watched her go, feeling something he had not felt in a long time. Curiosity, and something else he could not yet name. The line continued. More prisoners, more names, more faces that blurred together. But Emmett kept thinking about pale blue eyes and a woman who had read Fitzgerald in a country that had burned his books. He did not know he had just met the woman who would become his wife. He did not know that 40 years later, her secret would destroy everything he thought he knew about their life together. The United States Army had strict rules about fraternization with Germans. General Eisenhower's non-fraternization policy, issued in September 1944, was clear. No handshakes, no conversations beyond official business, no relationships of any kind. American soldiers were conquerors, not friends. The penalty for violating the policy could be a court-martial, dishonorable discharge, or reassignment to the Pacific Theater, where the war was still killing men by the thousands. Emmett knew the rules. He followed them for exactly 3 days. On the 4th day after liberation, he saw Annalise again. She was carrying a bucket of water across the muddy camp yard, struggling with the weight. The bucket tilted, water sloshing over the side, soaking her already worn shoes. She stopped, set the bucket down, and stood there for a moment with her head bowed, as if this one small failure was too much to bear on top of everything else. Emmett walked over. He picked up the bucket without asking permission. Where does this go? She looked at him, startled. You should not help me. The rules? I asked where it goes. Barrack 17. For washing. He carried the bucket across the yard. She walked beside him, silent, her hands clasped in front of her. When they reached the barracks, he set the bucket down beside the door. Thank you, she said quietly. You're welcome. He should have walked away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar from his K-rations. He held it out to her. Annalisa stared at the chocolate as if it were something from another world. I cannot accept this. Why not? Because you are American, and I am German. Because your people won, and my people lost. Because accepting gifts feels like surrendering something more than the war. It's just chocolate, Emmett said. But they both knew it was not just chocolate. It was kindness offered across a divide that was supposed to remain unbridgeable. She took his hint. Her fingers brushed his palm for half a second. Thank you, she said again, and this time her voice broke slightly on the words. After that, Emmett found reasons to be near Barracks 17. He brought extra rations, canned peaches, crackers, tins of Spam. He brought soap and clean cloth for bandages. He brought cigarettes she could trade for other necessities. Each time, Annalisa protested. Each time, she accepted. They began to talk. Short conversations at first, careful and formal. But gradually, the conversations grew longer. Anneliese told him about Regensburg before the war, a medieval city of stone bridges and Gothic churches, of university lectures and coffeehouses where students argued about literature and philosophy. She told him about her father Bernhard, who had been a music teacher, and her mother Minna, who had painted watercolors of the Danube. She told him about her brother, only 16 when he died in the rubble of their house. Emmett told her about Hollenbach, about the coal dust that covered everything, about his father coughing blood into a handkerchief, about his mother, Cordelia, who ran the Ktorit household with iron discipline, and never showed affection because affection was weakness. He told her about joining the army to escape, about discovering that war was worse than the mines in ways he had not imagined. By June, Emmett was visiting Anneliese every evening after his duty shift ended. They would sit on the steps outside Barrack 17, watching the sun set over the Bavarian countryside, talking in a mixture of English and German. Sometimes they did not talk at all. They simply sat together in a silence that felt more honest than any conversation. Other soldiers noticed. Corporal Kowalczyk pulled Emmett aside one evening. "You're playing with fire, Em. Lieutenant Patterson's watching. He catches you fraternizing. You're done." "I know." "Then why risk it?" Emmett did not have a good answer. Or rather, he had an answer he could not put into words. Something about Anneliese's eyes. Something about the way she listened when he talked. Really listened, as if his words mattered. Something about how she made him feel human again, after months of being a machine that killed. In July, the NAS fraternization policy began to collapse. Too many soldiers were ignoring it. Too many relationships had formed. The army started allowing limited social contact, though marriages were still forbidden. Emmett and Anneliese could sit together openly now, could share meals in the mess hall, could walk outside the camp boundaries. One evening in August, they walked along a dirt road outside Moosburg. The fields stretched flat and golden in the fading light. Anneliese stopped suddenly and turned to face him. "I need to tell you something," she said, "before this goes any further. Before you make decisions you might regret." Emmett felt his chest tighten. "What is it?" I am not the person you think I am. I have done things I am ashamed of, things I cannot undo." "We've all done things," Emmett said. "It was a war." "Not in the war. Before." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "There are things in my past, things I cannot speak about. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Emmett reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her beyond the accidental brush of fingers. "I don't care about your past. I care about who you are now." "You should care. You should ask questions." "I'm asking one question. Do you want to be with me?" Anneliese looked at him with those pale blue eyes, and he saw fear there, and hope, and something that looked like grief. "Yes," she said finally. "God help me, yes." They were married in October 1945 in a military chapel, after the army finally authorized marriages between American soldiers and German women. The ceremony lasted 10 minutes. Anneliese wore a borrowed dress. Emmett wore his uniform. There were no guests, no flowers, no celebration. Afterward, they stood outside the chapel in the cold October wind, holding hands, both of them wondering what they had just begun. Emmett had written to his mother in September, a short letter explaining that he had married a German woman and would be bringing her home to Hollenbach. He wrote that Anneliese was educated, that she spoke English, that she had lost everything in the war. He wrote that he loved her sake and hoped his mother would welcome her into the family. Cordelia's reply came 3 weeks later. It was even shorter than his letter. "Do what you must, but do not expect celebration." Emmett folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He told himself that his mother would change her mind once she met Anneliese. He told himself that time would soften her. He was wrong on both counts. They left Germany in December 1945. The military transport ship sailed from Bremerhaven carrying 800 American soldiers and 127 German war brides. The women stayed in separate quarters below deck, crowded into narrow bunks in a space that smelled of salt water, diesel fuel, and seasickness. The crossing took 14 days through winter storms that turned the Atlantic into walls of gray water. Anneliese was sick for most of the voyage. She lay in her bunk, unable to keep down the meals served in the mess hall, staring at the metal ceiling inches above her face. But the nausea was not the worst part. The worst part was leaving. She had said goodbye to Germany in Regensburg, standing in front of the ruins of her family's house. The building was gone. reduced to a pile of broken stone and twisted metal by American bombs that had fallen on a February night 9 months earlier. Her father and brother had been inside. There had not been enough left to bury properly. She had stood in that pile of rubble for an hour, memorizing the exact spot, because she knew she would never see it again. She had whispered goodbye to her father, her mother, her brother, and she had whispered goodbye to someone else, someone whose name she could not speak aloud, not even to Emmett, especially not to Emmett. During the voyage, Annalisa met other war brides, women like herself who had married American soldiers and were crossing an ocean to a country they knew only from movies and propaganda. A woman named Greta had married a farm boy from Iowa. Another named Trudy was going to Brooklyn with a soldier from a Jewish family who had fled Germany in 1936. They shared stories, fears, hopes, but Annalisa kept certain stories to herself. Some truths were too heavy to share. When the ship finally docked in New York Harbor on a freezing morning in late December, Annalisa stood on deck and saw the Statue of Liberty rising from the water. She had seen photographs, but nothing had prepared her for the size of it, the scale of everything in America. The buildings in New York were taller than anything in Regensburg. The harbor was filled with ships, dozens of them, more ships than she had ever seen in one place. They took a train from New York to Pennsylvania. The journey lasted 9 hours through a landscape of snow-covered hills and industrial towns. Annalisa pressed her face to the window, watching America pass by. Factories with smoking chimneys, small houses with Christmas lights, frozen rivers. Everything looked foreign and overwhelming. Hullenbach appeared through the train window just after sunset. It was not a pretty town. Coal dust darkened the snow. The main street was lined with brick buildings, their facades stained black from decades of smoke. Company houses stood in identical rows on the hillsides, small wooden structures painted gray or brown. The mine entrance was visible on the edge of Chamonix, a black mouth in the earth surrounded by equipment and slag piles. Cordelia Hollister was waiting at the train station. She stood beside a black Ford pickup truck, her arms crossed, her face expressionless. She was a tall woman, broad in the shoulders, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a dark wool coat and practical boots. She looked like a woman who had never smiled in her life. Emmett helped Annalisa down from the train. Her legs were unsteady after the long journey. She carried a single suitcase containing everything she owned, 3 dresses, some undergarments, a few photographs hidden in a false bottom that Emmett knew nothing about, and letters she could never let him read. "Mother," Emmett said, "this is Annalisa." Annalise had practiced this moment in her mind 100 times. She stepped forward and extended her hand. "Mrs. Hollister, it is an honor to meet you. Emmett has told me so much about—" "Get in the truck," Cordelia said. She did not take Annalisa's hand. She did not look at her directly. She simply turned and walked to the driver's side. The drive to the Hollister house took 12 minutes. No one spoke. Annalisa sat in the back of the truck bed despite the cold, because Cordelia had not invited her to sit in the cab. Emmett sat beside his mother, his jaw tight, his hands clenched in his lap. The Hollister house was a 2-story wooden structure on the edge of town, painted white, but grayed by coal dust. It had a sagging front porch and a chimney that leaked smoke. Inside, the house was dark and cold. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light. The furniture was old and worn. Everything smelled of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. Cordelia led them through the house, pointing out rooms without warmth or welcome. The kitchen, the parlor, the upstairs bedroom that had belonged to Emmett's father before he died. "You'll sleep there," she said. "Breakfast is at 6. You'll earn your keep." That night, Annalisa lay beside Emmett in the narrow bed, listening to the wind rattle the windows. She thought about Regensburg. She thought about her family. She thought about the secret she had buried in Germany, the secret she had promised herself she would never speak of, the secret that had already begun to crack her heart in two. She had crossed an ocean for love. But love, she was learning, did not make you belong. It only made you alone in a different country. Annalise woke at 5:30 every morning for the next 9 years. She lit the stove, made coffee, cooked breakfast for Cordelia and Emmett, oatmeal or eggs or pancakes, whatever Cordelia demanded. Then she washed dishes, swept floors, scrubbed laundry on a washboard because Cordelia refused to buy a washing machine. "German hands can work German dirt," Cordelia said once. and never explained what she meant. Cordelia watched everything Annalisa did. She criticized the way she folded sheets, the way she peeled potatoes, the way she spoke English with an accent that 20 years in America would never erase. Dazibs? Bunituba. Mansme, say it correctly, Cordelia would snap. Water, not Vater. You are in America now. The town was no kinder. Hollenbach in 1946 was a place where everyone knew everyone, and a German war bride was news that spread like fire. At the grocery store, women would stop talking when Annalise and Thibault entered. They would stare, then turn away and whisper, "So woman, Mrs. Pemberton," said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I lost a son at Normandy, died killing her people, and now she is shopping in our store like she belongs here." Annalisa pretended not to hear. She bought what she needed and left quickly, her face burning with shame she had not earned but carried anyway. At church, the Reverend Whitley preached forgiveness and Christian charity, but his congregation practiced neither. Families sat in the same pews they had occupied for generations, and no one made room for Annalise. She sat in the back, alone, while Emmett sat with his mother near the front. Cordelia had made it clear, "You are his mistake, not mine. You do not sit with family." In 1948, Annalise gave birth to a son. The labor lasted 14 hours. Emmett held her hand in the hospital while she screamed in German, words she had not spoken aloud in months, words that came from a deeper place than English could reach. When the baby was born, healthy and red-faced and howling, Emmett kissed her forehead and said, "We will name him Gregory, after my grandfather." Cordelia visited the hospital once. She looked at the baby, said, "He has the Hollister nose," and left without holding him. Annalisa loved Gregory with a fierceness that surprised her. She had not known she could feel this much again after losing so much. But loving him also broke her heart in new ways, because every time she looked at his face, she thought of another child. A child whose face she had memorized in a single afternoon before letting him go for ever. In 1952, she had a daughter. The birth was easier this time. They named her Marlene, and Cordelia said the name sounded too German and refused to use it, calling the girl Marnie instead. Emmett worked at the coal processing plant, operating machinery that sorted and crushed coal 12 hours a day. The pay was modest but steady. He came home exhausted, his clothes black with dust, his hands cracked and bleeding. Annalisa would heat water for him to wash, cook dinner, and put the children to bed. Then they would sit together in silence because Emmett was too tired to talk, and Annalisa had learned that talking changed nothing. But once a month, when Emmett worked the night shift and Cordelia visited her sister in Harrisburg, Annalise would lock the bedroom door and take out the wooden chest she kept under the bed. The chest had a brass lock. She wore the key on a thin chain around her neck, hidden beneath her dress. Inside the chest were letters, dozens of them, spanning years, written in German. They came from Regensburg, from an address Annalisa never spoke aloud. She read them slowly, carefully, sometimes with tears running down her face. Then she would write replies on thin airmail paper, her handwriting small and precise to fit as many words as possible. The letters came from a woman named Frau Edith Brenner, who ran a Catholic orphanage in Regensburg. They spoke of a boy named Joachim, born in February 1944. The letters described his growth, his health, his education. He had brown hair and pale blue eyes. He was good at mathematics. He liked to draw. He asked questions about his mother sometimes, and Frau Brenner told him that his mother had loved him but could not keep him, that she had made a sacrifice so he could live. Annalisa sent money when she could, carefully saved from the household allowance Emmett gave her. $20 here, $30 there, hidden in the letters. Money for Joachim's clothes, his school fees, his future. She never told Emmett about the letters. She never told him about Joachim. How could she explain that she had given birth to a child in Germany during the war? A child whose father had been a Russian prisoner forced to work on her uncle's farm? A child whose existence was illegal under Nazi racial laws? A child she had hidden for 11 months before placing him in the orphanage to save his life? How could she explain that she was not just Annalisa Hollister, mother of Gregory and Marlene, wife of Emmett? She was also Annalisa Kettner, mother of Joachim. Secret that could destroy everything. In 1955, Emmett saved enough money to buy a small house on the edge of town. It was a modest place, 2 bedrooms, peeling paint, but it was theirs. The day they moved out, Cordelia stood on her porch and watched them load their belongings into a borrowed truck. She did not help. She did not say goodbye. She simply watched, her face as cold as the day Annalisa had first met her. In the new house, Annalisa planted a garden. Tomatoes, beans, potatoes. In one corner, hidden behind the beans, she grew German chamomile from seeds Frau Brenner had sent. When she made tea from the flowers, she closed her eyes, and for a moment she was back in Regensburg, sitting in her mother's kitchen, listening to her father play piano in the next room. The years passed. Gregory and Marlene grew. They knew their mother was German, but they knew almost nothing else. They did not know about Regensburg, about the university, about the family buried in rubble. They certainly did not know about Joachim. Annalisa told herself she would explain someday, when they were older, when they could understand. But the years kept passing, and the right moment never came. The letters from Regensburg arrived every 2 months, regular as clockwork. Annalisa watched for the mailman from the kitchen window. When she saw the thin blue airmail envelope with German stamps, she would slip it into her apron pocket before anyone else could see. She read them alone, late at night. When Emmett snored beside her and the house settled into silence, Frau Brenner wrote in careful script about Joachim's life. In 1955, he was 11 years old and excelling in school. In 1960, he was 17 and had been accepted to technical college to study engineering. In 1965, he graduated and found work at a manufacturing company in Munich. In 1968, he married a woman named Petra. In 1970, he became a father to a daughter named Clara. Annalisa was a grandmother, and no one in her American life knew it existed. She sent money when she could, but more than money, she sent letters, long letters in German, pouring out everything she could not say in English, to people who could never write back with understanding. She wrote about Gregory and Marlene, about their school achievements, their graduations, their marriages. She wrote about Emmett, about his quiet kindness, about the way he still held her hand after 20 years of marriage. She wrote about the guilt that never left her, the feeling that she had abandoned one child to save herself, that every moment of happiness with her American children to whiz, betrayal of the son she had left behind. Frau Brenner's letters were always gentle. You saved his life, she wrote in 1962. Under the Nazi laws, a child born of a German woman and a Russian prisoner would have been taken from you and killed. You hid him for nearly a year at great risk. You gave him to the church when you could no longer protect him. You did what love required. But knowing something in your mind and feeling it in your heart were different things. Annalisa carried the guilt like a stone in her chest, heavy and cold, every single day. There were close calls over the years. In 1958, Gregory found a letter written in German on the kitchen table. Annalise had been reading it when she heard him coming and had only managed to flip it over. "What is that?" he asked. "A letter from an old university friend," Annalisa said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Someone I knew before the war." Gregory was 12. He accepted the explanation and forgot about it by dinner. In 1967, Marlene asked why her mother kept a locked chest under the bed. "What is in there?" "Old photographs," Annalisa said. "Papers from Germany. Things from before. They make me sad to look at, so I keep them locked away." Marlene, 16 and more interested in boys than her mother's past, shrugged and left the room. Emmett never asked about the chest. Perhaps he understood that everyone had things they needed to keep private. Perhaps he knew that Annalisa had suffered losses he could never fully comprehend. Or perhaps he simply loved her enough to let her have her secrets. In 1972, Frau Brenner wrote with difficult news. Joachim had learned the truth about his birth. He was 28 years old, married with a child of his own, and he wanted to know about his mother. He wanted to understand why she had given him away. Frau Brenner had told him the story. The Russian prisoner, the Nazi laws, the danger, the sacrifice. Joachim had listened, and then he had said, "I would like to write to her, if she is willing." Annalise sat with that letter for 3 days, reading it over and over. Her son wanted to know her. After 28 years, he was reaching across the silence. She wrote back to Frau Brenner, "Please tell him that I think of him every day, that I have always loved him, that leaving him was the hardest thing I have ever done. And yes, I will write to him." The first letter she sent directly to Joachim was 10 pages long. She told him about his father, a Russian named Alexei, who had worked on her uncle's farm for 6 months before being transferred to another work camp. She told him that Alexei had been kind, that they had talked in broken German and Russian, that he had shared his rations with her when she was sick. She told him she did not know if Alexei had survived the war. She told him about the pregnancy, about hiding him, about the terror of those 11 months when discovery would have meant death for both of them. Joachim wrote back. His letters were cautious at first, formal, asking questions about his medical history, his grandparents, his heritage. But gradually, the letters became warmer. He sent photographs of Petra and Clara. He wrote about his work, his life in Munich, his hobbies. He wrote, in a letter dated November 1974, "I understand why you did what you did. I do not blame you. I am grateful you gave me life, even if you could not give me your presence." Anneliese wept when she read those words, wept with relief and grief, and a love that had nowhere to go except onto paper and into envelopes that crossed an ocean. By 1980, Emmet's health was failing. Years of coal dust had damaged his lungs. He developed emphysema, then heart problems. He retired from the plant at 62 and spent his days in a chair by the window, reading newspapers and watching birds at the feeder Anneliese had hung outside. She cared for him the way she had cared for everything in her life, quietly, thoroughly, without complaint. She cooked soft foods he could swallow. She helped him to the bathroom. She sat with him in the evenings, holding his hand, listening to him breathe. In 1985, Emmet had a stroke. He recovered partially, but never fully. His left side remained weak, his speech slurred. He needed a wheelchair. One evening in October, as Anneliese helped him into bed, Emmet looked at her and said, slow and thick, "You have been a good wife, better than I deserved." "You have been a good husband," she replied. "I know you carry sadness. I have always known. I wish I could have taken it from you." Anneliese kissed his forehead. "You gave me a life. That is enough." But it was not enough, and they both knew it. Emmet died on a cold morning in Dorset in January 1986. Anneliese woke at dawn and found him still and silent beside her, his face peaceful, his hands folded on his chest. She sat with him for a long time, holding his cold hand, whispering words in German that she had not spoken aloud in 40 years. Words of love, words of gratitude, words of goodbye. The funeral was small. Gregory came from Cleveland with his wife Linda and their 2 children. Marlene came from Philadelphia with her husband Robert and their daughter. Cordelia had died in 1979, bitter and alone, never having accepted the German woman her son had married. A few neighbors attended, mostly out of obligation. The Reverend Whitley's replacement, a young minister who had never known Emmet, spoke generic words about eternal rest. They buried Emmet in the town cemetery next to his parents. Anneliese stood between her children as the coffin was lowered into the frozen ground. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that some grief was too deep for tears. After the funeral, Gregory and Marlene worried about their mother living alone. They offered to move her to Cleveland or Philadelphia, to be closer to grandchildren, to have family nearby. Anneliese refused. The old furniture, too worn to sell. And they found the chest. It was under the bed where it had always been, the brass lock still secure. Gregory used a screwdriver to break it open. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, spanning 40 years, all written in German. There were photographs of people they did not recognize. There were bank statements from a German bank. There were legal documents with official seals. Neither Gregory nor Marlene could read German. They stared at the papers, confused and overwhelmed. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at Gregory's house in Cleveland. It was postmarked from Regensburg, Germany. The return address said, Herr Dr. Albrecht Vogler, attorney at law. Gregory opened it with trembling hands. The letter was in English, formal and precise. It explained that Anneliese Hollister, formerly Anneliese Kettner, had been the owner of property in Regensburg. It explained that she had left instructions for the property to be sold after her death and the proceeds divided among her 3 children. 3 children. "I regret to inform you," the letter continued, that you have a half-brother named Joachim Kettner, born February 1944 in Regensburg. Your mother placed him in a Catholic orphanage as an infant to protect him from Nazi persecution. She maintained correspondence with him for the last 14 years of her life. Enclosed, please find a letter from your mother, written shortly before her death, explaining the circumstances. Gregory read the letter 3 times. Then he called Marlene. They sat together at his kitchen table, reading their mother's final confession. The woman they thought they knew, the quiet housewife, the German immigrant, the devoted mother, had been someone else entirely. She had been a survivor of unimaginable circumstances. She had made impossible choices. She had carried a secret for 40 years to protect a son she could never claim publicly. In the envelope was another letter, this one from Joachim himself. Staying meant she could continue writing to Joachim without explanation. Staying meant she could keep her secret a little longer. But her body was failing. At 70 years old, Anneliese had arthritis in her hands that made writing difficult. Her heart was weak. Some mornings she struggled to get out of bed. She knew time was running short. In March 1986, she wrote a long letter to Joachim. It was different from her other letters. It was a confession, an explanation, a farewell. She told him everything. About arriving in America, about Cordelia's cruelty, about the loneliness that had followed her across the ocean, about Gregory and Marlene, the half-siblings he had never met, about the guilt she had carried for 42 years. I want them to know about you, she wrote. After I am gone, I want them to understand who I really was. Not just Anneliese Hollister, the quiet German wife, but Anneliese Kettner, the woman who survived. The woman who loved 3 children, even though she could only raise 2. She included instructions. After her death, Joachim should contact a lawyer in Regensburg, Herr Dr. Albrecht Vogler. She had arranged everything with him during a secret correspondence that had lasted 3 years. There was property in Germany, a small house in Regensburg that had belonged to her mother's family, which had survived the bombing. The property had been rented for decades, the money held in a German bank account. After Anneliese's death, the property and money would be divided equally among her 3 children, Gregory, Marlene, and Joachim. This is my gift to all of you, she wrote. This is my way of bringing you together. Even though I could not do it while I was alive, forgive me for my silence, forgive me for my secrets. Know that I loved each of you with my whole heart. She mailed the letter, and then she waited. Anneliese died in her sleep on a warm night in August 1986. She was 71 years old. Marlene found her in the morning, lying peacefully in her bed, a faint smile on her face. On her nightstand was a photograph that Marlene had never seen before. It showed a young man with brown hair and pale blue eyes, standing beside a woman and a small girl. Marlene picked up the photograph and turned it over. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, were the words, Joachim, Petra, and Clara, Regensburg, 1975. The funeral was even smaller than Emmett's. Afterward, Gregory and Marlene began the difficult task of sorting through their mother's belongings. They found the usual things: clothes to donate, kitchen items to keep or discard, old furniture too worn to sell. And they found the chest. It was under the bed where it had always been, the brass lock. I would very much like to meet my American family, he wrote. Our mother brought us together in death. Perhaps we can honor her by becoming family in life. 6 months later, Gregory and Marlene flew to Germany. Joachim met them at the Munich airport. He looked nothing like them, and everything like the photograph on their mother's nightstand. He embraced them as if they had known each other forever. She spoke of you often, he said. She was proud of both of you. Standing in that airport, surrounded by strangers, Gregory finally understood. His mother had not been hiding a secret out of shame. She had been protecting a love that crossed borders and wars and decades. She had been holding together a family scattered by history. And now, at last, that family was whole. Anneliese Kettner Hollister had lived with her heart divided between 2 worlds for 40 years. She had crossed an ocean for love, endured decades of isolation, and kept a secret that could have destroyed everything she had built. But her silence was not weakness. It was protection. It was sacrifice. It was the fierce love of a mother who would do anything to keep her children safe. In the end, her secret was not a betrayal, but a bridge. It connected 3 children who had never known each other. It revealed a woman far more complex and courageous than anyone had imagined, and reminded her family that love does not diminish when it is divided. It multiplies. They had come to Germany as strangers. They left as siblings. And somewhere, perhaps, Annalisa was finally at peace.